Hello, everyone. We're going to get to some housekeeping in just a minute, but just as a heads up, I'd like everybody to mute their lines. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I'd like to wish you a good morning or a good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. This is the first part of a series of webinars titled The 4 W's of Education in Emergencies Data. Who, the first W, who has what data? What is the second W? The third W is where can I find it? And the fourth W is why. Why is this so complicated? So we're going to have 4 webinars. The first one is going to be today's, which is an overview of the education and emergencies data landscape. The second is going to be on July 19th, and that's going to be on navigating education development data for education and emergencies. The third is going to be July 26th, and that's on navigating humanitarian operations data for education and emergencies. And then finally, on August 2nd, you're going to hear about navigating population movement data and conflict data for education and emergencies. So I am really happy to welcome you today, and please, if you have any questions or comments, just note them in the chat box. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Annie Smiley, and I am the Associate Director of Research and Evaluation in Global Education, Employment, and Engagement at FHI 360. And I'm going to turn on my video really quickly so that you can get a chance to see myself and my colleague Sean. And then we're going to turn off the video for the rest of the session. Hopefully you can see us here now. So I'm Annie, and then I'd like my colleague Sean to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sean Kremen. I'm a research analyst here at FHI 360 on the Global Education, Employment, and Engagement Business Unit research team. I also support the Education Policy and Data Center, which is a global resource for data and research in international education. And I'll be presenting more on the back end of this webinar.
And I'll be telling you a little bit more about what Sean and I are doing specifically regarding the MEERS project, so we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to turn off the video for now so that we can save bandwidth, and we're going to keep going. So give us 1 minute. All right, so today we're going to introduce you to the EIE data landscape, and we're going to try to provide you with some background information that we think will be really helpful in understanding the subsequent 3 webinars. So this is really setting the scene for the webinars that are going to be coming over the next 3 weeks after this. So in terms of the agenda for today's webinar, I'm going to take you through a little bit about what MEERS is. This is the program that is basically funding this piece of work right now. Why are we focusing on education emergencies data? Then what does the EIE data landscape look like overall? And finally, then I'm going to switch over to Sean, and he's going to talk you through how does the humanitarian response system work, because we think that's really important for really giving you an understanding of what the EIE data coming out of the humanitarian response system looks like. Then what does the education development data ecosystem look like? And that, again, both of those topics, humanitarian response system data and education development data, will be delved into in a lot more depth in the subsequent 2 webinars. And then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So in terms of some housekeeping for everyone, please keep your microphone muted, and probably better to turn off your video in order to minimize background noise. We're going to be doing Q&A via posting questions to the chat rather than orally. So please just post your questions as you can see in the chat box there. Post your questions there, and we will respond to the questions after the presentation. So we'll get through the content, and then we'll look at your questions. The session is being recorded, just so you know. And the recording and presentations themselves will be shared on the INEE website at inee.org after the presentation is over. I'm not sure how long it'll take, but we will we'll let you know when they're available. All right, so we're going to start talking about what is MEERS. And MEERS is the Middle East Education Research Training and Support Program. It's a 4-year project that's funded by USAID's Middle East Bureau, and it's being implemented by Social Impact as the prime implementer. They're based here in Washington, D.C., in Northern Virginia. And then FHI 360 is a subcontractor to Social Impact, and that's where Sean and I sit. So the overall objective of MEERS is to support the USAID Middle East Bureau with continuous data collection, research, training, and analysis related to education, so related to learners, teachers, education systems, and overall education outcomes in the Middle East region. Now, that, as I mentioned, is led by Social Impact, the program is, but task 1 under the program is what FHI 360 is primarily responsible for, and that is a focus on continuous data collection on education in the 3 crisis contexts of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and the associated refugee context with those 3 crises. So I'm going to talk on the next slide a little bit about the process of what we've been working on over the last 1.5 years or so, and that will then take us into kind of why we're here today and what led up to this, this webinar and this training. So over the last 1.5 years, we've followed a process of going through a data mapping, a set of stakeholder consultations, a set of strategic meetings, and then brainstorming and beginning to act upon some, what we think are some new directions for improving the education and emergencies data landscape. In terms of the mapping, we, as I mentioned previously, are focused on the Middle East region of Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So what we started off doing was mapping all the education and emergencies data that's publicly available for those crisis contexts. And when we didn't start off by looking for publicly available data. We really started off by saying what data is available, and realized that it's really difficult to get anyone to share their data if it's not already publicly available. And so, I mean, everyone who's probably worked in the development sector or in the humanitarian sector can probably understand that organizations are not really excited about giving up their data. So we ended up focusing on education and emergencies data that's publicly available. And what was surprising to us was that we actually found a lot of data. And I'm going to talk more momentarily about what that data landscape ended up looking like. But we found a lot more than we expected. We had heard over and over again that there are gaps. And so we were excited to find a lot of data out there. Secondly, we did a series of stakeholder consultations, and some of you may have even participated in these consultations. We held a number of them with actors that are in the Middle East region, but also with actors working at the global level on EIE data, different aspects of EIE data. So many different UN agencies, the World Bank, multilaterals, bilaterals, as well as with implementing partners on the ground, with the Global Education Cluster, with US government actors in the Middle East region specifically. And we even held some consultations at the INEE meetings, I think a few years ago in Oslo, and then we held some additional meetings in Amman with other members that were working on education emergencies data issues in Amman about 6 months ago. So we've been doing a series of these consultations, really trying to understand what data do stakeholders collect, what do they need, and then what do they actually use, and then of course, what are the gaps in EIE data. So those consultations really provided us with some insight into the current status of EIE data. And I just want to ask if everyone could mute their line, because I am getting some, I can hear somebody typing. If you could please mute, that would be great. The third piece of work that we did over the last year was strategic meetings. So we realized that not only are there gaps, but there's also a lot of wonderful opportunities and a lot of great initiatives that are underway across many different organizations to actually address EIE data issues and challenges. So we started holding strategic meetings to try to understand what people are doing, what's happening, and kind of map out the different ideas and good practices and initiatives that are underway. And then we let all of this fed into some ideas on new directions. What can be done to support improved accessibility, quality, and navigability of EIE data? And that's where we are now. So in the last maybe 4 months or so, we've started moving into these new directions. So this webinar series is part of that. It started with a training that we conducted as a pre-conference workshop at the Comparative and International Education Society CIES conference meetings in San Francisco in April. We then worked with partners, NORAG and INEE, to organize an Education Emergencies Data Summit with a lot of partners that was held in Geneva in June, and that was preceded by a pre-summit training similar to the one that we had done in San Francisco, and with basically the same content that you're getting today and over the next 3 weeks after this. So that's where we're moving, and I just want to make an announcement, I guess, that the Data Summit outcomes will be available in September, and we have some really great action agenda items that we're hoping will kind of continue to move the community forward in terms of EIE data issues. Okay, to the next slide, and make sure, please mute your line, everyone. Thank you. So why are we focusing on education emergencies data? So we know, and this won't be a surprise to many of you, that in conflict and crisis-affected contexts, there are gaps in education data. There are quality and reliability issues, and these have been pretty extensively cited. But perhaps most importantly, this is a huge theme that comes up over and over again in all of our conversations. There's a lack of education data on displaced populations in conflict-affected contexts. And really importantly, that includes refugees, and it also includes the internally displaced. So currently, the world doesn't have a good strategy for collecting education data on either IDPs, internally displaced persons, or refugees. So this was a big theme in the EIE Data Summit, and will continue to be a big theme going forward for all of the work that we're doing. Finally, there's a significant demand for better EIE data. So clearly there's a demand for data on displaced populations, but there's just generally a demand for not only better data, but also better accessibility and navigability of data. You probably understood from the title of this webinar series that it's complex to find EIE data. It's not easy, it's a complex landscape. So that's why we're doing these trainings, is to help people understand what the data looks like and where to find it. So, and just to also note that INEE did a survey last November and December with INEE members to try to understand what sort of data, what sources of data EIE stakeholders use and what they need. So we did hear that clear demand for better data through that survey as well. Okay, so now we'll get to the content of what we really learned during our mapping exercise. What does the EIE data landscape look like? So overall, some of the high-level findings from our mapping and consultations were the following. We lack a working definition of what we mean by EIE data, but there are really pretty robust data collection systems out there, and we'll be getting into the details of those today a little bit, and then more in the next few sessions. We learned that most education emergencies data, now again, remember this is publicly available EIE data, not necessarily privately held data. Most of it comes from education development sources or humanitarian operations sources. And so humanitarian operations sources, of course, include education sources, but also more contextual data like conflict data or migration data. So, but the big point here is that we have kind of an education development side and a humanitarian operations side that are actually quite different from each other in terms of data. So let's look a little bit at the differences between these. When we're looking at data to understand the education emergencies, an education emergency situation from different angles, we find that development data often is only available before or after a crisis, but is broken down in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. So your administrative data coming from the Education Management Information System, the EMIS system, or from a government source is generally not available in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. Also, development data, generally those systems aren't currently collecting education data consistently on refugees or internally displaced persons. So this is a really, really important point. I know I keep stressing this, but we don't really have a good way of getting education data for refugees and IDPs, and this is something that sort of transcends the development and humanitarian context. We need to work together to have better education data for both of those sort of invisible groups. On the humanitarian operations side, there is a lot of data, but it's really difficult to find and it's difficult to navigate. There are lots of PDF dashboards, and that's an understatement. There are so many PDF dashboards for any given context that it can be overwhelming. There is more of a focus within the humanitarian operations data on supply, so on what programming is being provided, than there is on demand. So numbers of out-of-school children, for example, are harder to find, whereas how many children are being reached is easier to find, just as an example. And in the humanitarian operations side, there's a lack of consistent indicator definitions or even consistent indicators themselves. So across two different humanitarian contexts, you might have two slightly different indicators that kind of are getting at the same thing, and they're being defined differently, or the definitions aren't even easy to find. And then there's just a lack of quality controls. But I do want to say that there is, as I said, a lot of data, and there is a strong focus on data within the humanitarian sector. And so there is a huge opportunity to better draw on the humanitarian data that's out there in order to improve our sort of data availability for understanding education context. So in terms of where do you find publicly available education emergencies data, we wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of those sources. And so I'm dividing the sources into three categories. The humanitarian education response data, that's again sort of the humanitarian operations education data, that's up at the top. The second bar there is education development data. And then the third bar is also humanitarian data for the most part, or related to humanitarian data, and that's more contextual data on security and population movement, and other sort of relevant, not specific to education sector types of data. So on the humanitarian education response data, that first category, we end up seeing, and Sean will talk about this a bit more, but we have data in humanitarian response plans and humanitarian needs overviews and needs assessments that tends to be annual, and that's collected by UN and clusters and their partners. And then the dashboards are monthly, and those are generally sort of updating the indicators from the humanitarian response plans and needs overviews, and those are collected again by UN and clusters and partners. Then you have the 3 and 4 and 5W reports, which are collected monthly. That's really trying to get at who's doing what where and for whom. And so again, same partners are collecting that, generally available monthly. And then we have financial tracking service data trying to track, and that's UN OSHA, trying to track finances. So that's, you can see that data tends to be available pretty often, monthly, and then the annual HRPs and HNOs. Now on the development side, as you can imagine, the data is much less frequent. We have in development context, generally they're not fluid, they're not changing all the time, and so there isn't that need for ongoing constant data collection. So the sources of data are generally administrative sources like EMIS systems, education management information systems coming from governments, and then those are aggregated into other data sets like the UIS. As Sean mentioned, the Education Policy and Data Center is based here at FHI 360, and that's EPDC. We aggregate subnational administrative education data. We have World Bank EdStats. We have the WIDE database. So those are just some examples. And then there's also great data coming out of the big international learning assessments. Of course, that's generally not available for crisis context. And then we have some data coming out of HDI and ILO on an annual basis collected by UN. So it's just a lot less frequent for the most part, and generally it does generally break down during a humanitarian crisis. The third bucket, of course, is contextual data. And so we have some really great sources of data that we one of our arguments is that we should be better drawing on contextual data within the education sector, not only because it can inform planning and response, but also because there's opportunity for including education indicators sometimes in those sources of data, and sometimes there already are education indicators in those sources of data that we're not drawing on enough or sufficiently. So we've got sources like UNHCR PopStats, IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, et cetera, that's available pretty much annually on population movement. The IOM Displacement Tracking Matrix is out there. ACLED collects data on security. And then GSIPIA is a great example. That's the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, is doing really great work on collecting data on attacks on education, which is another good source of data for EIE. We want to talk a bit about the humanitarian development divide and how it's manifested through data. So just really quickly on sort of the humanitarian and development sectors, they have different mandates and they tend to have different values. So on the humanitarian side, the mandate usually is life-saving assistance and relief, whereas on the development side, the mandate is sort of longer-term improving human well-being, including reducing poverty and improving health. They also have different values. So humanitarian organizations tend to value humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, whereas on the development side, the values are really around sustainability and systemic change and long-term capacity building. So the point here is that when we have protracted crisis conditions like we see so often today, those lines are blurred, and it's no longer completely clear always what is a humanitarian context and what is a development context. You see different agencies on different ends of the continuum, which is why we have these agencies listed out below, with UNHCR and OSHA tending to be more on the humanitarian side. On the development side, you see the World Bank, USAID, for example. UNICEF is kind of in the middle, straddling both. But generally speaking, those lines are blurred, and it's not entirely clear what any given context is. Sometimes it's clear if it's clearly a humanitarian context or has clearly moved out of a humanitarian context, but very often we're seeing people in displacement for long periods of time, for example, that really end up blurring those lines. So what are some important key assumptions that affect humanitarian and development data systems? So a few of them, I mean, this is definitely not all, but some of the main ones are that on a humanitarian context, the target population is unknown. That's one of the big challenges of a humanitarian context, is that people are moving, so you don't know who's in your population at any given time. Whereas on the development side, you do have a relatively clear reference population, so you understand, where their geographic boundaries are. Generally speaking, it's relatively stable. That's not the case in a humanitarian context. Also, in a humanitarian, on the terms of the time frame, in a humanitarian context, it tends to be time bound. Although, as I said earlier, this is changing. And on the development side, we can track progress to development goals at regular intervals. So it tends to be just a much longer term process on the development side. And then in terms of who the lead actors are on the humanitarian side, it tends to be sort of non-government, so civil society, UN agencies, multilaterals. And then on the development side, it tends to be national governments that are the lead actors when it comes to development. But again, these lines are blurring, and so it's not entirely clear always what the difference is between humanitarian and development, or why there is this divide when it comes to data, when many of these contexts sort of share or aren't entirely clearly in one or the other of these two sides of the spectrum. Just to drive the point home a little more, here are some differences between the actual data on the humanitarian and development side. So on the development side, data is infrequent. On the humanitarian side, it's frequent. On the development side, again, you have a relatively stable reference population. You know who the population is. You don't have that on the humanitarian side. On the development side, there's a focus on the overall education system. So the health of the system, learning outcomes, access to education, retention, all of that. Whereas on the humanitarian side, the focus is on generally on what education services have been provided. So again, on that supply rather than on demand. And often those education services that are being provided are outside of the system because the point is that the system has broken down in many of these contexts. And then finally, we have a relatively clear understanding of what data coverage, reliability, and quality mean on the development side. And we don't have that at this point on the humanitarian side. Now, that's not always been the case. So it's relatively recent, actually, that on the education development side that there has been more clarity on what we mean. That's because a lot of actors have put a lot of work into really clarifying what education development data looks like and sort of building an education development ecosystem. And Sean will talk about that a little bit later as well. So it's certainly possible that the humanitarian side can move in that direction. Finally, in the middle of our Venn diagram here, we found some overlap. And this is where the humanitarian and development divide breaks down a little bit, and we start to see that there are some reasons why we should be coming together between the the development and humanitarian sides. So the first is that the populations of interest to these two sides, or these two types of actors, tend to be very similar. And there's a strong focus on including refugees and IDPs into education data, into the education data landscape and into education statistics. So I think both humanitarian and development actors can come together around finding solutions to make sure that refugees and IDPs are included. Also, we found when we did our interviews and our stakeholder consultations across both humanitarian and development actors that both sides needed similar information and needed similar indicators. So there wasn't a clear difference in what their data needs were across these two sets of actors. But in fact, everyone who was working in these contexts needed basically the same kind of information. So we found that to be a compelling argument for, again, pulling together education and development development and humanitarian actors around data. So we want to eventually move towards improved humanitarian development coherence, and that's true as a sector. And so it's a conversation that's happening not only around data, but just in general. And at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, there was a lot of discussion around what's called the new way of working. And the new way of working is really about coming together between humanitarian and development actors and moving from a state of fragmentation where people are working in silos and working separately towards bridging and coordination, and ultimately towards collective outcomes. So working together across humanitarian and development actors to agree on, in any given context, what outcomes we look to achieve, and then working together to achieve those outcomes rather than working in silos. So this is something that we feel the conversation around data can certainly contribute to this new way of working. All right, so now another sort of outcome of the MEERS process and the MEERS stakeholder consultations has been movement towards a user-oriented data framework. So I mentioned that education actors in emergency contexts end up having many of the same education data needs, regardless of whether they're humanitarian or development actors. So those end up in 6 categories that we've identified of types of data or types of users or types of uses for education emergencies data. And those 6 categories are what you can see on the screen. So we have people tend to need data for program planning and design, for coordination, for education sector planning and policy reform, for monitoring and accountability, for evaluation and learning, and for advocacy. And when we were in Geneva at the EIE Data Summit in June, these same categories came up over and over again as people sort of looking at EIE data from different lenses depending on what their specific data needs are. And so we feel that it's important to bring everyone together around an understanding of why people need data, what they need it for, and so how we can sort of improve the data landscape so that different types of data and different levels of aggregation of data are available for these different needs. All right. I am going to hand over to my colleague Sean to walk you through the humanitarian response system.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Annie. So the purpose of this section, which might be a review for some of you who have been working in humanitarian response now for a long time, is to really look at the humanitarian response system and see what the implications are for data of this system. So we'll be looking into, a brief overview of the humanitarian response system, and then looking also at briefly looking at the educational development data ecosystem, and then we'll follow up with Q&A at the end. Great. So this visual is really just to provide a high-level overview of the evolution of a conflict or crisis, and to look closely at what humanitarian response looks like. And I would just like to preface this with, this is clearly, not, it's a very basic visual, and it's just to walk through different stages of the response and of the conflict. And we know that these situations typically are nonlinear and could be happening, or very complex, and multiple phases of these conflicts could be happening in the same context at the same time. So we just want to preface that we understand that in this visual. So first, all the way on the left, we see, an onset of an emergency. Typically, what's needed is life-saving assistance and relief at that time. And under, you see the different humanitarian clusters that work in these situations that are common across the humanitarian response. So we have camp coordination and camp management, TCCM, WASH, protection, health, food and nutrition, shelter and non-food items, and education, which is, of course, what we are most focused on in this series. So typically, if the emergency becomes more of a protracted crisis, then this sort of life-saving assistance is still happening, but it becomes more long-term, so it's more about service delivery for these populations that may be displaced now for years in camps or non-camp settings, and for host communities. And if there starts to be an early recovery phase, it's more about, rehabilitation and restoration of these basic services, getting people, returnees, to come back and filling their needs. And then at the end, there would be, this development. But in a context like Nigeria, there's development activities happening more in the south, southwest, and center of the country, but in the northeast, where there's been conflict for the last decade or so, there is all three phases of these conflicts happening at the same time. So emergency in some places where there's hot conflict, in some places there's protracted crisis where there's been IDPs for now, over 5-6 years in some states, and then some parts of the northeast are in early recovery. So we just see that in the humanitarian response system, there's just all these different phases happening, and it creates a very complex setting that will, in effect, create a complex data system as well. And in this slide, we're talking about who is doing what as part of this response. So we'll see at the global level, it starts with the UN General Secretary for Humanitarian Assistance at the highest level. Oh, sorry about the text looks a little bit blurry, but we'll walk through the text on this slide. And under that would be the Interagency Standing Committees, or IASC, and global clusters. So for example, there's the Global Education Cluster, sorry for the background noise. And at the national level, there is UNOSHA, or the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, working with humanitarian country teams, or HCTs, and governments, and as well as national clusters. So for example, the National Education Cluster would be at this level. And then at the local level, there's subclusters and implementing partners, INGOs, NGOs, and other partners who are working on the ground. So this slide is pretty key in terms of when we start talking about what the implications of the humanitarian response system are for humanitarian education data. And that's because Well, just to start with the definition, the humanitarian program cycle is a coordinated series of actions undertaken to help prepare for, manage, and deliver humanitarian response. So typically, let's just say that a conflict begins and a team is put in place. Actors start mobilizing to respond at the onset of a crisis. So there'll be a needs assessment done at the onset, which on an annual timeline would be the humanitarian needs overview, and which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. But this is the key output of sort of this first phase of response, and that provides a lot of the numbers of people in need. It defines essentially the population of people in need and what those needs are. And so once that document is published, then there would be a humanitarian response plan that's produced out of that, and that is really more setting up the strategic objectives and indicator framework that will then be monitored, throughout the cycle of that response, typically on an annual basis for the HRP and HNO. And we'll see if we continue down going through the visual and circle, then resources are mobilized, people start bringing in services, support is provided, and in terms of data, that's when really monitoring activities begins. And so in the humanitarian response system, as part of the cluster system, we start getting these data dashboards produced on a monthly level, and 6 months in, a periodic monitoring report, which summarizes maybe the first 6 months of the response. But really, something that we found and something that we looked at and Annie touched on is these monthly data dashboards, and that's where there becomes an overwhelming number of these dashboards created across the response, many for education and across the clusters. And we'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation, but really this is setting up what we'll talk about in the third session on humanitarian education data. And this slide just briefly highlights what the HNOs and HRPs are for those of you who might not be familiar. But essentially, HNOs are reports produced at the beginning of a response cycle to document the needs and populations in need. And HRPs are planning documents that define the monitoring framework and determines the strategic objectives, indicators and targets, and cluster plans that inform implementation. And again, these are informed by HNOs, and HRPs are also crucial for funding of these humanitarian situations. So the namesake of this presentation, of this webinar series, the 3, 4, 5 W's, who is doing what, when, and for whom. This is just to provide an example of what we're talking about for one piece of data, or one tool used for data on the humanitarian response side, humanitarian operations data. So a 3, 4, 5 W stands for who's doing what, where, when, and for whom, when all 5 are being collected. Depending on the context, it could be a 3 W who's doing what, where, a 4 W, or a 5 W. So we just have all 3 listed. And it's a mapping tool to show really partner and operational presence. So what type of partners are implementing what type of activities and where. And this is crucial for humanitarian or for complex conflict or natural disaster situations, because we want to coordinate as best as possible these responses and avoid the duplication of efforts during these responses. And so there are national level 3, 4, 5 W's collected through a reporting mechanism known as activity info, which essentially is aggregating up partner reports of their data from their location and aggregating it to, then the national or subnational level, depending on what type of 3W is being used for that situation. And we'll talk more about 3, 4, 5 W's in webinar 3 coming up in 2 weeks. And again, just excuse me, just to provide an example of a data dashboard that is typically produced on a monthly every month or so as part of a response. So these dashboards are created by the cluster are published by the clusters to consolidate partner data. And these are tracking progress against targets set in the HRP. So for example, if we have an indicator that is number of teachers trained in social emotional learning and psychosocial support activities, and we set that target in the humanitarian response plan, each month, January, February, March, etc., we'll be tracking progress toward that target of, let's say, 10,000 teachers. So maybe in January, we'll see 1,000 teachers, in February, 2,000 teachers, in March, 3,000. And so these dashboards are used to track progress towards those HRP targets. And again, they're PDFs, but what's happening, what we've been seeing as we've been, continuing our data mapping throughout the life of the MEERS project, is that a lot of these PDF dashboards are now being made into live dashboards using Power BI. So we're still not seeing like the Excel spreadsheets that are being produced that have all this data, but we're seeing, instead of having a monthly dashboard for January and a monthly dashboard for September, we're seeing all the data aggregated into a live dashboard that a user can interact with on humanitarianresponse.info. Again, something that we'll touch on more in the humanitarian education data webinar in 2 weeks. So finally, just to wrap up on humanitarian response system and its implications for data, we just want to have a quick conversation about challenges and quality issues with this data that we'll continue on and discuss more in future webinars. So first, as Annie mentioned, during these onset of emergencies and these crises and conflicts, essentially institutions and systems collapse if, at least in some parts of the country where there is, the conflict is occurring, or maybe in the entire country if the central institutions and systems collapse, which creates a massive problem because we're not then getting representative data from across the country, and then that's what makes us rely more on this UN implementing partner data that's occurring in humanitarian response. Another challenge, as Andy mentioned, is that beneficiaries or populations, people are moving constantly during these conflict and crisis situations, which provides a huge challenge of tracking people. So in a development context, maybe where the population is more stable, we can track beneficiaries maybe over the life of a project or over multiple years. So we have that data, but for these situations, people are moving too frequently, and that becomes a major challenge. Another along these lines is access. So we might not be able to access the parts of the country that are, have the highest level of conflict occurring. So we don't have data from where we can't, where we don't have humanitarian response. We don't have access to that data, which is a huge challenge. Sometimes there's limited capacity or oversight for using this data or gathering and collecting it, which leads to issues down the line and could lead to even like a lack of reporting, not just underreporting. There could just be a complete lack of reporting from maybe one location. That is a challenge. And as Annie mentioned earlier, indicators differ across context, and indicator definitions could even differ in the same context across months, which is something that we've seen while looking at all these humanitarian dashboards, is that sometimes even within the response under a single HRP, indicator definitions change month to month, which creates a problem for tracking that indicator. Yeah, and again, so all of this humanitarian system data and education data that we're talking about under the humanitarian response will be going into much more depth and taking much more time to spell out in the session in 2 weeks on humanitarian education data. And before wrapping up and going to questions, we'll just take a brief look at what the educational development data ecosystem looks like. And to preface this one, we'll see that it looks a lot different than humanitarian response system. And the reason for that is that, as Annie mentioned, there's been a lot of effort and time put into improving educational and development data systems. For example, EMIS systems that have been on the rise in the last couple of decades have been increasingly important in educational and development data. And we have, because humanitarian situations are so complex, we just don't have systems like that in place yet. And I'd just like to thank Patrick Monterides from NORAG for providing us with these slides, and he helped us present on this in the EIE Data Summit in Geneva back in June. So this, it's kind of difficult to see all the visuals, but that's not necessarily the point of this slide. We see that we really just want to see that on the left, we're looking at primary data sources, and in the center, we're looking at primary international data sources, and on the right, we're looking at secondary international data sources. So on the left, where we get this educational development data is mainly from country EMIS systems or education management information systems that are essentially administrative data from statistical offices of ministries of education that get admin data from across school populations in that country. Another big one, as Annie mentioned earlier, is international large-scale assessments. So, you know, a lot of you may be familiar with international learning assessments, so like PISA, TIMSS and PEARLS, and the like. And then household surveys like MIX and DHS, and then population census data. And then these are often found in primary international data sources like UIS.stat, OECD.stat, and for population data would be the UN WPP, World Population Prospect data. And then a lot of that data is then aggregated and calculated by secondary sources like the World Bank, EPDC, WIDE, and UNESCO GEM report statistics. And this last slide that we'll just cover very briefly, and again, I think these will be made available, this content will be made available for you to take a look at more in depth if you're interested, is just on data gaps in the educational development data ecosystem. So we see that, you know, we have decent data for primary education and early childhood education when it comes to enrollment, teachers, graduates, teacher training, government expenditure. Well, that's when there starts to be more gaps. And then we see more for professional training or TVET, tertiary education. We have, you know, a few more gaps. And again, all of this we'll talk more about next week, actually, in the educational development data webinar. And just to make sure we have at least 10 minutes for questions, I think we'll jump to the Q&A session and start answering some of the questions that you typed into the chat bar.
Great. Well, thanks, Sean. And it's been really great to see how many people are interested in this topic and to see all of you here on the webinar. We do have about 10 minutes, so I think we've got one comment so far in the chat box, and you're welcome to also type in your questions or comments to the chat box now. While we're waiting for that to start coming in, just if you need more information on this, you can feel free to contact myself or Sean at FHI, and our emails are up there on the screen. Andrew Epstein is the MEERS Project Director at Social Impact. You can also reach out to him. And then Christine Carpacci-Carneal is our USAID Contracting Officer's Representative managing the MEERS program, so she can also be reached at her email there on the screen. So I am going to take a look at what we've got on the screen so far. So we've got a question on, well, actually it's a comment, and it's a great comment. So it says, another key aspect distinguishing student data management between the humanitarian and development settings is data confidentiality and risk at higher granularity. While EMIS can have an expected degree of privacy, the risk for data on refugees and IDPs is much higher. That is a really great point and formed one of the big discussion points at the EIE Data Summit in Geneva. Risks are very high when it comes to, identifying, for example, refugees within national education systems. We don't necessarily want to ask a question in a national EMIS, are you a refugee? That can come with major risks itself. And then, there are many other types of risks that we face as well. So, for example, if we're collecting data on locations of schools, you don't necessarily want that to be in an accessible format so that insurgents can find out where the schools are, or where education programs are taking place, or the names and identities of participants in education programs or teachers. So I think that is a point that we need to do better actually about including on these slides, because it is clearly a difference between the development and humanitarian spaces, and as I said, it was a major theme in the data summit, so it's something that we'll be addressing going forward. So thanks for that. Next question, in terms of translating collected data, how can users verify sources or its internal use, or is it internal use only? Translating as in language, let's see, in terms of, maybe if you can clarify, translating collected data into dashboards, or what do you, okay, how, oh, I see, it's not language, I see. When it is put into a dashboard, how can we verify sources, or is it internal use only? So do you want to try to answer that? I think it varies depending on the education cluster.
Yeah, I think it does. I think in terms of data, what I can say is in terms of data collection, what's being put into the dashboards that we talked about in this presentation is partner data that's being collected as part of programming that's going on the ground. And then they have their own indicators and project indicators that they're looking at, but some of them are tied to the education cluster and HRP targets that have been set at a national level that everyone's trying to respond to, and those are then aggregated up into maybe subnational or national level dashboard, and the source for that would be the publisher, which is either the cluster working in line with you and OSHA. So that's the source. I'm sorry if that is not exactly what you're looking for in response.
Please, yeah, feel free to
clarify
in the chat box if that didn't fully answer your question. Are there any other questions? And I know it takes time to type. Okay, here's another one. There seem to be lots of sources of data. Can you comment on the quality and reliability of data overall? I know on the development side it's varied, but I get a sense there are many weaknesses. Would you agree? What are the key priorities, gaps, needs, et cetera, if we are to shape better overall data? I mean, I can take a first stab at that, and then maybe, Sean, you can jump in as well. Yeah, I mean, there's major issues of quality and reliability as you said, on the education development side, as well as on the humanitarian operations data side. Some of the priorities that were identified at the EIE Data Summit last week included trying to come together around shared indicators and shared indicator definitions as kind of a basic foundation, as kind of a low-hanging fruit, something that we can come together as a community and just say, okay, we're gonna have these shared indicators, we're gonna identify them. I mean, we're gonna define them in pretty much the same way, but that isn't gonna solve all of the problems. Some other problems are that a lot of the data, including the 3, 4, and 5W data, is voluntary. So the institutions don't have to report that data, and so it's not complete. And that's another challenge, is that we never know if that, how complete that data is. There are additional challenges, as I'm sure many of you can imagine, around, data is useful for advocacy purposes, and different organizations use data to make the case for the kind of funding that they need. And so there are incentives to, there could be incentives, there not necessarily are, but there could be incentives to distort data to try to make a particular case or gain particular funding. And so we need to grapple with those kinds of incentives and disincentives as a community as well. So issues around capacity building as well. I mean, that was another huge theme at the summit, was how do we improve the capacity of organizations on the ground that are collecting data, organizations at higher levels that are responsible for aggregating and sharing and analyzing and visualizing data, so that we can sort of improve the entire data ecosystem with better capacity. What else would you add, Sean?
The only thing that I would add is just, I would certainly agree that there are weaknesses in reliability and quality issues on the development side, and also on the humanitarian data side. I think, just the complexity and how complicated situations are in the humanitarian side just is replicated in the data. Like, we just see that happening mirrored in the data that is produced by it. We just see, it's really complicated to collect that data and to get it. And so, of course, we have to take that data with a grain of salt. And I think we will, we start our humanitarian education data presentation with actually having a discussion on the quality and reliability issues of that data at the forefront, because it's just really important to note those, that with all these sources that we're talking about, as Annie mentioned in her example, that, for some of these 3-4W reporting mechanisms, people can just do it voluntarily, so there could be underreporting or a lack of reporting. So maybe these numbers that we have to rely on as part of the response might not be as accurate as we would like.
And there was a follow-up to that question, which is, Sean, I've often found that national and subnational cluster data dashboards in a crisis context, protracted crisis, are incomplete or inaccurate.
Right.
So I think that goes along.
Yeah, that goes along exactly with what we're saying. And that's all we have. So it creates a situation where it's about improving these. How can we get them to be more accurate? Because a lot of different organizations and entities are relying on these numbers. So I think it's a conversation about how we can try and get the most accurate data within those dashboards.
Yeah. Okay, we have 2 more minutes, so let's see if we can get through these. I wonder if there's any initiative to increase the data from displaced people, like creating bottom-up awareness, or can people be encouraged to register through social apps which can collect data for the humanitarian or development purposes? So I don't know of anything exactly along those lines, but there are initiatives coming from the IOM Displacement Tracking Matrix, from IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, from UNHCR. So across IDPs and refugee agencies to try to improve the tracking of education data for these populations. However, it's really difficult, and the security, the sort of the ethical implications are really, big in this context, as we've already mentioned. So it's not easy, and I think that this is really the big challenge that our community needs to figure out. I'm interested in the idea of an app, or so other sort of more innovative ways of possibly gathering this kind of information. I haven't heard about anything like that yet. And then there's a final question here: is the Open Data Convention functional in humanitarian context? And I'm sorry to say I don't know the answer to that. We talked about open data at the summit, and it was primarily in the context of an initiative by UN OSHA called the Humanitarian Data Exchange, where UN OSHA is really working to try to pull together humanitarian data from all sectors. And they've got folks working on education data, and we've been partnering with HDX to get some of the cluster data up on HDX. I encourage you all to look at HDX and Google it, look it up, see what's there, because they're trying to start bringing in education data, and it's kind of in the service of open data. But I actually don't know if the Open Data Convention applies to humanitarian organizations. If anyone has the answer to that, I'd love to hear it. I think we're out of time. It's exactly 10 o'clock, at least not here in Washington, D.C. So we really appreciate that you attended, all of your questions. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this and a lot of momentum around it, and it's challenging. So we're really happy that you joined. Looking forward to hopefully having you back next Friday, same time, and the following 2 Fridays after that. Thank you very much, and hope everyone has a great day.